Welcome back. Joining me now to share his insights is retired Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, who's also Senior Defense Strategist with Samuels and Associates. Thank you so much for joining me today, Vice-Admiral.
Well, thank you, Tanya, for having me.
Well, when we're looking at Ukraine, and I know before we started recording, I was sharing that for me, as a young child of Slavic descent, it really triggered a lot of emotions for me. And watching the tanks roll in, they're awful scenes, and the humanitarian crisis that's now ensuing. A lot of Canadians are responding emotionally. And I want to speak with you because, I want to take the emotion out and really see what's happening and what can be done, what should be done, and the conversations that need to happen. When you and I spoke several months ago, we talked about asymmetrical versus conventional warfare. And, when Crimea, that area of Ukraine, which was then annexed when the Russians annexed it, it was done through non-conventional, asymmetrical means. But now we're seeing conventional warfare at play. How does Canada, or how do we approach the situation when things keep shifting between conventional, non-conventional warfare?
Well, it's a great question. I think the way you've laid it out goes right to the heart of one of the dimensions of this, which is the human dimension. And that's probably worthy of a bit of focus, because notwithstanding how things might play out from a strictly military perspective, that there is an enormous human element of it, and we're seeing it on an hour-to-hour basis in this particular conflict, and that's why so many Canadians and others are very concerned about what's happening. And I think, when we look at that, we start to consider the impacts of social media, for example. And this is a key element of what's playing out right now today. We have sort of two versions, if you will, of the narrative. One is the Russian version, which is being passed around inside Russia and outside Russia. And the other is the versions that we're getting on the ground from Ukraine. And this is a really good example of how the power of the human component of this can be such a pivotal instrument in dealing with what's happening. And that's why we've got such a massive call for action and call for support on behalf of the Ukrainian people. That's why President Zelensky is being so effective. And I think that's partly why we're seeing a lot of criticism in the West for what appears to be a lack of action.
So when thinking about the action, again, even as you mentioned, through social media, through President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, directly speaking to us, directly to the world, and good for him for utilizing those platforms. What should the reaction be? We hear continually the demand for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and that to the layman sounds okay. Yeah, great. Let's have no-fly zone. Let's make sure no planes fly over Ukraine. Therefore, no bombs can be dropped. But what does that mean practically? If we declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine, either through the UN or through NATO, what does that mean? What is the end result of something like that?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to answer that question through the context of roles and responsibilities in NATO really quickly here, because I think it's important for your viewers to understand that NATO's primary responsibility is the defense of NATO and its member nations, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO. However, NATO has in the past intervened in other conflicts, both in its near area of influence and more broadly around the world. But the issue of a no-fly zone is a really good example of this frustration that I was referring to earlier. In essence, what we are talking about is a declaration of an area that would be denied use by aircraft but for the Russians. And this would mean a direct action, military action by NATO, if we assume that NATO are the ones who are would do this. And that would put NATO forces in direct potential conflict, not just with the aircraft of the Russian armed forces that could be flying in Ukraine, but it would also put them in potentially direct conflict with Russian air defense capabilities, missiles and the like, that could be based actually inside Russia because they have extensive ranges of multi hundreds of kilometers. So this is why this is such a difficult issue to get our heads around.